Bonjour, Anin. My name is Holli Sayies. I'm an Indigenous Consultant for Learning for a Sustainable Future. I'm also a classroom teacher and a beadwork artist. I'm going to talk about how to start with Indigenous education. And starting with Indigenous nation terms is a really good place to get started. I start with this every year in my classroom because when we're talking about Indigenous people, it's nice to know who exactly we're talking about, give the students context, and talk about a lot of these words that will come up and maybe that we're unsure about. So, to start Indigenous nations terms, there are three main groups of Indigenous people recognized in the Canadian Constitution, and this is Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people. So, I'm going to explain a little bit about all of these groups. And before I do that, it's best to be very specific when you're talking about Indigenous nations because they're all so different from one another. There's hundreds of nations with different cultures and languages and histories. And using the word nation is best practice because they have everything a nation has. And I would avoid using the word tribe or spelling these words with lowercase letters to start. And this is because I feel like it kind of diminishes the idea that these nations are nations. And we would never spell Canada with a lowercase c, for example, or call Canada or Canadians, tribal members. And I know this can be like a legal term, but I'll explain some of this as well. Like in the United States, they say tribal leaders and stuff. So using capital letters when spelling these terms is best practice. And being specific, if you're not sure, you can ask. You can ask the Indigenous person, you can ask your school board, school division, or Indigenous lead about the groups that you are learning about, the land that you are on, and stuff like that. So, and if you're unsure, using Indigenous is a safe and general term that you can use to talk about all of these groups. So I'm going to talk first about the Métis Nation. So the Métis Nation, specifically the creation of the Métis Nation, dates back to this fur trade era. And this is when First Nations women would have families with European men that were coming over from Europe. And there's this mixing of cultures and families. And so this comes from the French word métissage, which means to mix. And you must be a member of the Métis Nation, like a descendant of this nation, to be considered Métis. For example, for like let's say today, some people get together and they have a baby, and one of the parents is European and the other is First Nations. The child would not be Métis. They have to come from this lineage of Métis people during the fur trade era. They would just be First Nations, and then they would be European. And so we see this mixture of the cultures in the language, in the culture itself, like this new culture that it created. And the language itself is called Michif and is a mixture of French nouns and Cree verbs. And if we look at the photos, the one on top is obviously influenced by more of the First Nations side with the beadwork. And on the bottom, we see like this musical instrument, fiddle, and that is obviously has the European roots to it. And so if we talk about Métis land, Métis lands traditionally or mainly are like Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, like the central, and also parts of the prairie. And also there's Alberta, British Columbia, and some places in Quebec in the United States. And this has a lot to do with history and some land rights and land disputes issues with Métis people. And there was a time where Métis people actually had to disperse, and then we see like this growing of Indigenous territory. If we talk about First Nations people, we're referring to the first inhabitants of North America or Turtle Island. So First Nations people have occupied and lived on Turtle Island since time out of memory. They've always been here. And there are hundreds of First Nations groups all over Turtle Island, and they all have their own distinct cultures and languages. If we talk about First Nations land, this is mainly all of Turtle Island or North America. And this could be, places in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. All of Canada was occupied by Indigenous nations before the arrival of Europeans. And so some of these nations include the Ojibwe people who refer to themselves as Anishinaabe, the Cree people who refer to themselves as Innu, and many more. There's hundreds all over Canada. And you'll see like this traditional name, and then you'll see like this more of a European name that was given to them. For example, Ojibwe people call themselves Anishinaabe, but Europeans would refer to them mainly as Ojibwe. Inuit Nation, and so the Inuit people mainly inhabit the northern and Arctic region of Turtle Island, and many Inuit people speak Inuktitut. And within the Inuit Nation, there are different nation groups. For example, the Caribou Inuit, the Copper Inuit, the Yupik, and many, many more. When we talk about Inuit land, we're talking about this traditionally this Arctic regions, but this could include Nunavut, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Northern Manitoba, Quebec, Alaska, and Greenland. So this is a good visual I like to give to my students. I actually draw an umbrella on the board and I talk about how these are umbrella terms and then these are getting more specific. For example, Indigenous would be considered an umbrella term because this is talking about any of the groups. And then we have the words Aboriginal, Native, Indian, Native American, and these words can all be used to talk about all these groups. They're not recommended to use, and I'll explain why, but they would be considered umbrella terms that people use them to talk about all Indigenous groups. And then we see the three main groups underneath, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. And then within those nations, there are subgroups. For example, in the Métis Nation, you can be Scottish Métis, French Métis, Red River Métis, and you can be status or non-status, and I'll explain that after. So same thing with First Nations groups. There are actually hundreds of First Nations with their own cultures and languages, government structures, etc. And they also can be considered non-status or status. And then for the Inuit Nation, like I talked about before, you could be considered, for example, Caribou Inuit, Copper Inuit, Yupik, etc. And so if we talk about this framework that we're using, I also explain to my students, saying you're Indigenous is like saying, I'm Canadian, I'm from Canada. And then if you want to be very specific or more specific, you'll say, oh, I'm Métis. So maybe that's explaining, oh, I'm from Ontario, like your province or territory. And then when you say, I'm Red River Métis, you're being even more specific. So maybe you're saying the city that you're from or even the neighborhood that you're from. And so that's how these terms get more specific. And so Métis people do hold status, and this would mainly be from a Métis federation. And now different provinces are recognizing these federations. For example, Manitoba now recognizes the Manitoba Métis Federation as like a provincial government. And so they would have rights associated with that. And these are different from First Nations status rights, which are involved with treaties. And so First Nations people can have the status or not. You don't have to have status to be considered First Nations. But this means if you do have status, it means that you are recognized under the Indian Act and there are treaty rights associated with that if you hold the status. So I'd like to talk more about these umbrella terms that I mentioned. And so Aboriginal, that's not considered like an offensive term. It is a bit outdated and you won't find it as often as you find the word Indigenous. If you're looking at resources and you see that word coming up, that's just a word that was used very commonly before Indigenous took its place. And it's not offensive, like I said, just outdated. Then we have the term Native American, and this is very commonly used in the United States, just like tribe and Native American. They're very American words to use, but we don't really use them in Canada. And some people would find the term Native offensive. And so some people do not find this term, like Indigenous people don't find this term offensive, but some do. And that's why it's not recommended to use. And this word might come up because when we talk about Indigenous people and history, like these words they intertwine with the history. They are part of Indigenous history. And so I'm going to talk about some terms that are quite contested and can be considered derogatory. And these words can have a negative impact on Indigenous people's positive sense of self. And the reason to bring them up in the first place is because they are still legal terms that are used today. And we need to understand the context. And we need to teach our students why they are no longer used and the effect that these words can have on people. And so these are the terms that we're going to talk about. And like I mentioned, why even bring them up if they're derogatory and offensive terms? And it's because they are part of Indigenous histories and they will come up in resources. And when we talk about Indigenous people and history, they will come up. And so the term Indian is a contested term that can refer to all Indigenous people or just First Nations people. And it's actually still a legal term used to describe First Nations people. So this is, for example, like in the Indian Act and the treaty rights that I mentioned before, it's actually called Indian status. And so this word is still used today, and many people don't like it. Some Indigenous people don't have any problem using this word, and some refer to it, like use that word to refer to themselves, but some find it offensive and derogatory. Then we have the term half-breed. So this is a term that would refer to the Métis Nation, obviously being this mixture, half European, half First Nations. And it was used a lot in history to talk about Métis people and specifically land. And some Métis people won't have a problem with this, but some definitely will. I mean, the word itself, using the word breed, when we talk about breed, we think about animals or dog breeds, which in itself is derogatory to refer to people as. Then we have the term Eskimo. So this is a contested term that is talking about Inuit people. Some Inuit people might refer to themselves as Eskimo, and this was a term that was used by the Canadian government and like in legal documents, and it will come up in maybe older Inuit resources because it was a term that was accepted. Now it's not an acceptable term, just to use loosely, and it is important to talk about these terms so that students understand the context of them and how they are no longer used and why they're no longer used, and the effect that it could have on Indigenous people who are part of these groups. So Indigenous people refer to themselves in many different ways, and I would like to talk about all of them. So some Indigenous people refer to themselves as a specific nation, like I talked about. So maybe this is like saying what city you're from. So I'm Anishinaabe, I'm Innu, I'm Red River, Métis, Yupik, etc. Some people mention that they are a singular member of that nation by saying I'm Anishinaabe, I'm an Anishinaabe woman. Some people from the Inuit nation would say I'm Inuk. It's a singular person from the Inuit. Some Indigenous people just say Indigenous in general, and this might be because they are from multiple Indigenous nations. Some Indigenous people will just say, I'm Métis, I'm First Nations, or I'm Inuit. And some use those contested terms that I just talked about, like, oh, I'm an Indian. Maybe they'll say that. So culturally, Indigenous people, the way that they talk about themselves and refer to themselves would be in a traditional language. And the introductions include spirit names, clans, where they're from, and acknowledging non-human relatives as well. This is specifically speaking from an Anishinaabe or a Cree perspective. So the goal is, in sharing all this information, is to create new relationships. This is where I'm from, this is my traditional territory, this is where my family is from. And to explain like existing relationships, like this is my family, like maybe we are related. And so also acknowledging like the land, water, animals, birds, insects, fish, plants, etc. as members of our family, because of course we need all of these members of our family. And of course to acknowledge a traditional land that we're on. So this is an example of a traditional introduction in Anishinaabemowin. You say Bojo, and then Doug. So hello to all my relations. Sabe Memegijik. So that would be like a spirit name, someone would say, and then they'd say Nindijnakas, so they would say that's my name. Migazini Dodem, I come from the Eagle clan. Winnipeg Ninjunji, I'm from Winnipeg, and Miigwech. So in the language, it actually means more. It doesn't translate well in English. It means more than what you're saying. So Miigwech, for example, doesn't just mean thank you. It means thanks, and I acknowledge this reciprocity. So usually Indigenous people, specifically Anishinaabe people, are very generous in their introductions and sharing about themselves, and this goal is to create relationships. And so I hope that you learn something and you can bring this to your classroom. And so I have some other tips for incorporating Indigenous education into your classroom. If this is something that you're just starting with, something that you're not comfortable, you can definitely use these terms. And I recommend starting in your comfort zone. Maybe don't stay there long, but starting in your comfort zone is a great place to start. Sticking to facts and scientific ways of knowing and factual history is a really good place to start as well. It could be like something as simple as using Indigenous posters and imagery in your classroom so that Indigenous students feel like they feel a sense of belonging. And of course, to non-Indigenous people, that like Indigenous culture is part of your classroom atmosphere. So you can also start with learning these Indigenous terms or even just words here and there in Indigenous languages. There are many lesson plans from Indigenous platforms that you can just Google, and they're ready to go lesson plans. They're free. You can learn Indigenous people and history in general around you. So you can say, oh, this person who's famous is from Winnipeg, for example, like Kent Monkman. He's from Winnipeg and he's this artist, and you can talk about that. You can learn about the land that you call home and whose traditional land it is. You can, and like I mentioned before, like sticking to this scientific and factual perspective. So that's this two-eyed seeing approach. So seeing Indigenous people as first chemists and engineers and inventors, and bringing in like this modern science understanding with this traditional science understanding and blending the two. And of course, learning about your subject area and the Indigenous intelligence in your subject area specifically, because we're all most comfortable in certain subjects. And of course, Learning for a Sustainable Future has many, many, many good resources on the R4R website in French and English. So this is resources for rethinking, and you can pick specifically, the sustainable development goal, Indigenous knowledge maybe that you want to incorporate, and how that aligns with your provincial curriculum and the subjects and the units that you're teaching. And these are a great way to incorporate Indigenous education as well, in addition to maybe learning about these terms. So thank you so much for listening.